Andrea, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Boy, I'm looking forward to talking Prince, Purple Rain, 40 years. I don't remember when the album came out, so I'm showing my age. But yeah, it's such a phenomenal album, and it gets better as the years go on. And there isn't really a better person to choose to tell Prince's story for this book than yourself. Tell us about your background covering Prince in print and on the radio and podcasting, and how you eventually met the man himself, who I understand was a fan of your work.
Oh, yeah. Feels very surreal to really recount any of that. But yeah, I've been a music journalist in the Twin Cities for 20 years now. And of course, if you're going to cover, local music in Minnesota, you have to know about Prince and be following him closely. So I started writing about him pretty early on in my career, but it really ramped up around, I would say, 2013. He kind of rerouted himself in Minneapolis at that time. He'd been spending a lot of time out in LA, renting houses out there. And he came back home and he started, throwing more parties, concerts, last minute little shindigs all over town, showing up at clubs here and just being really present in the scene. So I started writing about everything that he was doing, starting with a show that he played at the Dakota Jazz Club. It was a rehearsal show for the NPG. So there were like 15 or 16 of his musicians crammed on this tiny little stage in this club that held maybe 250 people. And they didn't allow any cameras or phones or anything. So that was, something I was covering, and I had to really think about how I was going to do that. And kind of as a joke, I drew this little drawing of him in my notebook as I was taking notes of the show, and I posted that with my review. And that just started this whole exchange with him. He had his manager reach out to me and asked if they could have that drawing, and he ended up using it as a cover art on YouTube for like a bootleg recording of the show that he released through his YouTube account. And that was a trip. And then within a year,
yeah, what a trip.
Within a year, I was face to face with him, meeting with him and talking to him at Paisley Park. And that was really wild. That was the 30th anniversary of Purple Rain, to the day, actually, of the album coming out. So that was June of 2014. And we had a great conversation that night. It was a really unforgettable experience, just, getting to chat so intimately with him. And then after that, it was every single thing he did. I was getting personal invitations. He had the expectation that I was going to be writing about everything he was doing. And then he would, even in the final days, he was tweeting out links to everything that I was writing about him, which was really surreal. I keep coming back to that word, surreal. So it just kind of escalated over the last few years of his life. And then, after his shocking death, I transitioned into this role of helping the estate do things around his legacy and tell these stories and interview people about his life. And I've started doing a podcast for the estate, the official Prince podcast. And now I've interviewed like over 150 of his associates, people that worked with him throughout his whole life and career, and people that knew him. And it's just really taken over my career in a way that I did not see coming, but that has been such a gift because it's introduced me to so many amazing people, and it's really brought me so much closer to him and his work and what he meant to all of us.
It's amazing. How long were you a fan of Prince's? When did you first become a fan?
Well, I don't remember a time in my life that he wasn't part of, the fabric of life, and his music was in the air and his videos were on TV. I was born the day it turns out that he recorded Let's Go Crazy. So I
That was the
turned
day you
40
were
this
born.
year.
Wow.
Yes.
Boy, this is,
So
it was meant to be. Yeah.
my mom showed me recently in my baby book, she wrote that Prince was, they're supposed to write like current events that are happening in the world when your baby's born. And it was Prince that he
That's
was
amazing.
becoming really popular and that everyone in Minnesota was really proud of him. So I just always knew about him and his music and knew that he was from Minnesota. And I was really proud of that. And I know he was really proud of the state too. And then, like I said, as I got into actually working in the music industry as a career, then I really kind of put myself through Prince school and really tried to learn, about his back catalog and all of the different things that he did throughout his life. And it's an ongoing process. I mean, I'm years and years into this thing now and learning new things every day.
When you met him, did he tell you what it was that he liked about your writing? Did he indicate to you what it was that he connected with? Because I don't think, I mean, I don't even, I never knew he even read stuff about himself. A lot of artists don't, they don't want to know,
Right.
you know?
I knew that he followed the local media scene just from other stories of other journalists that I'd talked to over the years. There were a couple instances of people that I knew that had actually been called out there for various reasons by him and yelled at, or not yelled at, but maybe scolded is the right word for various
Yeah.
things that they had written. So when I got called out, I was certain that's what was happening. I figured we hit some kind of nerve, and he definitely teased me a little bit. Because I had just done a big special on Purple Rain, and I think he was making a point to me that, he was so present and so forward facing that he found it pretty ridiculous to spend time looking that far back, at that point, 30 years back. And, he walked me down to his studio and he swung the door open and he said, "This is what I'm doing now." And he played me material from 2 albums that he was getting ready to release because he was that prolific. So he was definitely making a point, but it was a gentler, kinder meeting than than the other journalist meetings I'd heard about. And he was not the kind of person that would ever say, why he chose anyone. Of all the people I've interviewed that came into his orbit, that was just not something that he did. Um, he would not really speak directly about his, feelings for people, his appreciation for people. That was just not really part of how he interacted. But after he passed, that's when I was told that he liked it, that it was something that he followed and that he appreciated. And just that, learning that was kind of life changing for me, to hear that he felt that way about me. But it really gave me this purpose that I still feel like I have now to keep doing this work and to try to honor him.
There was something interesting that you wrote in the book. It's in the introduction, I believe, where you talked about when you met him. And it was an unforgettable meeting that, quote, I would only understand in full detail years later. That made me curious. What did that mean?
Yeah. At the time I was covering him so much, I would write about everything he was doing, and it was so ongoing and so all the time that I never stopped to really reflect necessarily on on what it meant or why he was doing anything that he was doing. So at the time, like I mentioned, I wasn't sure if I was in trouble or if he was appreciative or if he was just scoping me out, because I was starting to write about him more. I really didn't know what that was all about, why I was invited there. But now that so much time has passed and I've talked to Bobby Z a lot about it, who was with me that night, Bobby Z, drummer for the Revolution and long, long time close friend of Prince's. I mean, they knew each other when they were 15, and Bobby knew, Prince pre-fame and was really at his side through so much. So, in talking to him and reflecting on it more, I really do think it was him proving a point about where he saw himself in the music industry and how he appreciated being talked about, which was as a constantly creating, forward facing songwriter and creator and visionary, and that it was about the next thing for him and not looking back. And now that I've had time to think about it, that really resonated with me, especially working on this book, which is about looking back, about, how he needed to position himself in order to keep creating the volume of work that he did.
Yeah, there were so many influences as we go back to the beginning, so many influences for him musically. It all makes sense after reading the book. He starts off on James Brown and Ray Charles and Smokey Robinson, Aretha Franklin, but then his dad takes him to the theater to see the Woodstock film, and his mind is blown by Hendrix and Sly and the Family Stone and Santana, and then it's like, oh yeah, it's all there. It's all like that mix. Uh, you know, focusing on Purple Rain, you write about how this album challenged the stubborn, segregated mindset of the music industry. Can you expand on that and the importance of this album in terms of breaking down that mindset? Because Thriller is like that as well, I think, in terms of, at one point MTV was just playing all white artists.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was just talking today about what the Minneapolis sound is and how you define it. And of course, it's so closely related to Prince and everything that he made, especially in that early to mid 80s period. And I think that there's something at the core of what we call now the Minneapolis sound, which is, you know, electronic drums and synthesized horn parts mixed with all these funk and R&B influences to create something really very cutting edge in the early 80s. But it's fundamentally about mixing these different genres together that had been separated by a music industry that had these really serious racial divides. There were literally black charts and white charts, and white radio stations and black radio stations. And I mean, this goes back decades before Prince, but it was something that I think he saw as a challenge when he was signing to Warner Brothers and starting to position himself as, you know, almost an adversary to this industry and to a lot of their long held beliefs about how music should be marketed. There's a quote from him. I talked to Lenny Waronker, who was one of the Warner Brothers executives that signed Prince. And Prince looked at him when they were in this like first meeting in the studio and he said, "Don't make me black." And it wasn't about, you know, denying his own blackness and the fact that he came from this rich African American community, but he knew that if they made him overly and overtly a black artist, that it was going to limit the reach of his music. And he was really intentional about breaking through that. He had a mixed race band at a time when that wasn't very common. He was obviously influenced by, you know, Sly and the Family Stone and other artists of that flavor that were, you know, starting to try to integrate bands and bring in more women and have more representation in that way. So that helped him to, you know, break out of some of the barriers in the Twin Cities where we were dealing with a lot of club segregation. And then the sound that he made was, it seems tailor made to call into question, you know, why they're spinning certain kinds of music on certain radio stations and why can't this music be for everybody? I have to think of, you know, a modern contemporary comparison like Beyonce releasing her country album and daring country stations not to play her because she explicitly is making the kind of music that they play and trying to break through that barrier. And he was just so strategic about it from such an early age. And I really think that's impressive and kind of a part of his career that isn't as discussed as the music itself.
He was never played on the rock stations here where I am in Connecticut. And I never understood that. And then years later, it really was that appearance at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that a lot of my friends who were into rock and roll, like they woke up and realized, oh my God, like this guy can rock. You know, there was when While My Guitar Gently Weeps, I think with Tom Petty up there, and now all of a sudden everybody's like, oh wow, okay, I get it. But yeah, never played on any of the rock stations. Top 40, yes. Rock, no. Which was always strange because I mean, listen to him on guitar. I mean, that's rock and roll.
Absolutely.
Now, those previous albums leading up to Purple Rain were primarily solo recordings, but on Purple Rain, it's credited as being produced, arranged, composed, and performed by Prince and the Revolution. So this is interesting. Tell me about what led to him forming this lineup, because Bobby Z told you it took some time for Prince to figure out what role he wanted his backing band to play. So that took a little while for everything to kind of come together.
Right. Yeah. You know, from an early stage in his career, he knew that he wanted to be a mentor and a maker of proteges. That was something that was just so obvious early on, you know, with making the time. And even before the time, he had a band called the Rebels that was made up of members of some of the members of the Revolution around like 1979. So he knew that he wanted to mold these groups of people and make different artistic statements with them. But I think what happened by the time he got to the Revolution is that he found a group of people who he had a vision for and that he arranged in a certain way, but who also were in turn inspiring him. They were coming to the table with different musical influences than he had, like Wendy and Lisa with their, you know, huge admiration of Joni Mitchell, who Prince also really admired, but I feel like they kind of brought that side out of him a little bit more. And, Dr. Fink being such a keyboard wizard and really coloring some of the sound with the technology that he was really interested at the time. So Prince was really starting to feed off of these musicians and respect them as collaborators and as peers and not just, a band that he can kind of shape and bend to his will. So I think it's so powerful that he, decided to co-credit them alongside him with, the Purple Rain album. And then in the movie, there's even, the plot in the movie about, taking Wendy and Lisa seriously as co-composers and hearing their ideas. And although that's a fictionalized version of what happened, during the writing of that album, it really represents, I think, this opening for him of letting other people into his creative space, which up until that point had been extremely closed off and very sacred to him. He rarely let other people into the studio other than a few people up until then.
And the Revolution is written backward on the cover art for 1999, right?
Yes. Yeah. A little
I love that
hint.
trivia. Yeah, I love that trivia. There's a few more. My brother, by the way, is a huge Minnesota Vikings fan. So I have yet to tell him about the ending to the song Purple Rain and the crowd sound, which we're going to get to. But
Yes,
yeah, I haven't
I
told
love
him that yet. Yeah. But there's one Prince show that became one of the most legendary and heavily bootleg shows of his career. And that was a show that took place at First Avenue in Minneapolis, August 3rd, 1983. So talk about this show, its importance to the record as well.
Yes. So the film had already had a screenplay drafted. It was in the process of being kind of rewritten and edited at that point. And there was this knowledge in, everyone that was working with Prince that there was this movie coming and it was going to be the next huge thing that they're going to be working on, and that there's all this new material pouring out of Prince that he was making for this movie. And they had already been rehearsing like crazy in their rehearsal warehouse. And there's so many interesting things about that show, but one of them is that at that point, Des Dickerson had just left Prince's band, and Wendy Melvoin had just come in as the new guitarist. She was 19 years old. Prince
Wow.
found her because she was at the time dating Lisa Coleman, and they had toured together on the 1999 tour. And Prince was walking through a hotel one night and heard Wendy playing her guitar and was absolutely mesmerized by this young, phenomenal talent. So that show at First Avenue in August of 83 is Wendy's first show with Prince. And it's at that show when they recorded the versions that we know of Purple Rain, of Baby I'm a Star, of Let's Go Crazy. These are the versions that you're hearing in the film that made it onto the soundtrack. Purple Rain was much longer at this performance. It ended up getting edited down a little bit. It's still a long song even on the album. But it's just so incredible to me to think about, a 19-year-old young woman coming into this world and playing those iconic opening chords of Purple Rain. And I think it says so much about Prince's creativity that he really valued putting people on the spot, seeing what they were going to do with a big opportunity, and capturing your first instinct at an idea and seeing what that was going to sound like. So that show is so legendary. I hope that eventually, the whole thing is released in a really high quality. I know there's video of it because the club First Avenue recorded everything at that point. They had cameras set up. So I hope someday that can come out because it's just such a huge piece of Prince history and music history, and just such a great example of how he worked.
Yeah, you have the picture of the venue in the book, and I think pictures from the show in there too.
Yes, yeah. I was so excited to work with some Minneapolis photographers on this book because there's so many that have followed him closely and had shots that a lot of them hadn't really been widely distributed before. So that was exciting.
Speaking of seeing him live, when did you see him live for the first time? How many times did you see him
My
perform?
first time was in 2001. Like I said, 40. So I was coming of age. I think I had just turned 18 when I saw him for the first time. He played a big arena here, and it was part of one of his early celebrations. He had a lot of events happening out at Paisley Park, and then he ended the week with this big show at a big arena here called Excel Energy Center. And it was honestly, I was pretty far up in like the nosebleeds. I there were definitely moments where I was like, wow, this is incredible. But there were other moments where I'm like, what is even happening? And now that I've talked to a lot of people about that era, it turns out that was just like a really rare bad Prince show. Like he was just not
Really?
on his A game that night. He was really upset with how the venue sounded. So he was very frustrated and just kind of distracted by that. And it explains a lot, but I think it's kind of funny that that was my first time. I tried to go out to Paisley Park after that. They told everyone to go to Paisley after at the show. And me being a dumb teenager, I didn't know that it was going to cost money. So I waited in line for like 2 hours and then got to the front and didn't have any money to go in. So kind of a funny start to my Prince fandom. But after that, once I started actually professionally writing about him and covering him for my career, I saw him so many times here in town, especially in those last few years. I mean, he was playing some points every week, every other week. He would go through these little spurts where he'd just have a lot of activity and I would just be out there all the time. Actually haven't counted up how many times, but it has to be at least dozens because there were big shows and small shows and pop-up shows and rehearsals and yeah, just kind of a dizzying time to be following him that closely.
What an amazing performer.
Yes.
I mean, just that presence on stage, larger than life, and you realize that was the thing over the years. You realize, oh, he's just a little guy. He's like larger than life, but that he really had that presence on stage, electrifying, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's hard to explain to people. I've talked a lot about him obviously over the years and to people that never got to see him. And it's goes beyond just being a good performer, being like proficient at his instruments. There was something about him. He had a magnetism, he had a charisma, and he made it look so easy. Like the music was just flowing through him and out of him, like he was just this vessel for it. And it's really rare to see a musician that comfortable on stage. I think, of all the different areas in his life where he existed, I think being on stage was his most natural state. You could just see that it helped him relax. It made him look joyful and it connected him to like his true self. Like I really think that, after watching him play, like it's really rare to see someone in that state where they're just flowing and giving you their raw talent as it pours out of them.
The book gets into both the album and the film. I'm going to focus probably more on the album, but just let people know there's a whole lot of information in this book that you cover. The film, also his younger days and his music career in Minneapolis, and each of the 5 studio albums that led up to Purple Rain, and his backing band. And actually, we should mention, let's see, all the names of the guys in the band. We have Bobby Z on
Yep,
drums,
drummer Bobby Z.
Bassist.
Mark Brown
Mark
/ Brown
Brown?
Mark.
Yeah, Brown Mark. That's why I was like, am I reading this right? Guitarist Wendy Melvoin, keyboardist Lisa Coleman, keyboardist Matt Fink, right?
Yep.
Okay.
That's the core 5. And then from then the Revolution expanded in later years, but that's the band that he was working with for Purple Rain.
So focusing on the album, that opening track, Let's Go Crazy, wasn't immediately perceived as a religious song about heaven and God's salvation, but that is exactly how Prince intended it. He had to change the words up in the song. What were the changes, and can you talk about why he changed them?
Yeah, this was something he commented on much later. It was in the late 90s. He was speaking to Chris Rock for an interview on MTV, and he talked about how he didn't feel like he could say explicitly that song was about his belief in God, in his Christian God that he was devoted to throughout his whole life. He felt like that would not make it onto radio, not make it onto MTV, and that it would have people perceiving him in a certain way. So he was really creative in how he talked about God and the devil in that song, calling Satan the de-elevator, which I don't know if people pick up on that, even now that we've heard that song so many times, that's what he's saying. Sounds like the elevator, don't let the elevator get you down,
Did not know that until reading the book.
But he's talking about, the evil and the devil getting you down, and that you have to focus on, heaven and the higher power and staying positive and going crazy. And that was a really great example of how clever he could be about integrating his spirituality into his music. And and later in his career, especially as he went through his Jehovah period, in the late 90s, early 2000s. He was getting pretty explicit about his spirituality at that point. But early on in his career, it's woven into almost every song, but it's all kind of hidden in these double entendres and kind of metaphors like that.
The second track, Take Me With You, a song meant to showcase Prince's co-star in the film, Patricia Kotera, known famously as Apollonia. And there was an emotional conversation she had with Prince in 2014 that you talk about in the book. Can you share what she told you about? It was a phone call.
Yeah. So she came back to town that year, and it was the 30th anniversary of Purple Rain. That was the same time that I got called out to Paisley to meet with Prince. Just a few days later, he called up Apollonia, knowing that she was in town to play this benefit concert that Bobby Z had put together. And he had her come out to Paisley Park. He walked her around and showed her, where he wanted it to eventually be a museum devoted to what they had done together in Purple Rain, and gave her a private concert. And she said that they were able to tell each other how much they loved each other, and that experience was so profound for both of them. And it was, yeah, very emotional for her to recount that. She told me about that when I interviewed her that summer, when Prince was still with us. And then in the years since, it's become even more profound.
Do you think Prince was misunderstood as a person because he was shy and he didn't talk to the press a lot? Was he
Yes,
misunderstood? Yeah.
absolutely. When I started writing about him, one of the most frustrating aspects of trying to research him is that he did all these interviews where he refused to be recorded. So you would have an interviewer like me at that point, getting called out last minute to go to Paisley Park. You're flying by the seat of your pants. You have maybe a notebook that you're allowed to have out, but maybe not even that. And he's telling you all of these incredibly insightful things about his life and his work, and you're supposed to just remember it and then go, later and write it down. And of course, he's going to be wildly misquoted and left up to interpretation based on whoever he was talking to. And, as someone that I really value oral histories and people being interviewed on record and being able to look at those transcripts. It's really frustrating to me that Prince didn't allow that to
Why,
happen, because I think we would understand him so much more.
why didn't he? Why didn't he want you to record it?
He, what I've seen him say, I did not have this conversation directly with him about it. I just knew based on reading other people's things about him over the years, is that he was afraid that someone was going to record his voice, his speaking voice, and sell it. And that
Mm.
was the same reason that he didn't allow, certain band members to record rehearsals, even if they needed something to work out a part. Or he was really private and really cautious and aware that people were avidly bootlegging every single thing that they could find that he was doing. So I think for him, it was a control issue, and also a issue of, if you're going to monetize me, I should be the one that is profiting off of that, not you. So I think he was really just kind of cagey in that way. And he had early interviews in his career before 1999 even came out, where he was speaking on the record to people that were allowed to record him. And those are some of the most fascinating interviews that you can find, because it's actually verbatim, word for word, what he said. And you can see how he thought and how he expressed himself verbally. And yeah, it's something that I think about a lot, is like, what would our experience of relating to him been like if he had allowed that kind of access at any point in his career and opened himself up to the public in that more authentic way? Of course, we'll never know. But, when you look at how he was treated in the 90s, when he changed his name to a symbol, he was basically like the laughing stock of mainstream media. And the reasons behind it were so much deeper than what was ever explored in, media around him. And if he had just given one good interview in 1996, I think it could have been so incredibly powerful. But, that's just my opinion. And now I've forgotten entirely what you were
Ah,
asking
no,
me.
no. I remember that, but I remember that time so well. And I was asking if he was misunderstood, but yeah, I
Yeah.
remember that time so well because it was like a punchline, like the symbol, like, oh, people rolling their eyes, like, get over yourself, but we realized years later that he was fighting for other artists, and against the
Yes.
labels too. I mean, a lot of these artists were just getting robbed, and he was standing up to that. And then he had "slave" written on
Hmm.
his face, I think, at the MTV Video Awards or something. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's yeah, that's just the was he always seemed very standoffish. He had that look, that what's the word, that coy look on his face, like there was something he was thinking. Is like, you'd be like, what is he thinking?
Yes.
You never know what he's thinking. Yeah.
Well, and there was just something mysterious about him. I mean, even people that quote
He may
unquote
have wanted it
knew
that way,
him.
though. That
True. Oh
that
yeah.
that that is missed among today's. Everybody knows everything now with social media, and everybody's got their
Yeah.
phones. You can record and video everything, but there was a mystery about him, which you need that.
Yeah, he kept control of his mystique in a really really great way. But I do think even people that were close to him, as close as anyone was able to get to him and be his friend, even they, only saw part of him. He was really a compartmentalized person. He had a lot of different people that he knew for different reasons, and I just don't even know if he allowed himself to fully be, understood by people in his life.
I forget if did he ever talk about writing a book?
He did.
He did.
He started working on one, I
That's
should say. He
you. I
didn't.
think you
Yeah.
mentioned it in this book.
Yes.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
he
So
was
he
starting on that.
he unfortunately started working on it 3 months before he died. So he only got something like 30 pages down handwritten. He was working with a co-author. They were going to work on it together, and he had just selected the co-author and inked the deal in like February of 2016, I think. So they'd only gotten a little ways in. But it's a really valuable text, because the co-author, Dan Peipenbring, he wrote this really long, beautiful foreword explaining the process of getting to know Prince through this whole experience, and what he was talking about and what was on his mind and what he wanted to say in the book. And it's really revealing and interesting. And he wanted it to be a tell-all. He was going to set straight like all these rumors and records about him, and really tell his story in his words, much in the same way that he was doing with the piano and a microphone shows that he was playing in the last months of his life. I was lucky to be able to see the one he did at Paisley Park, in January of 2016. And, he was pausing between these beautiful solo renditions of his music at the piano and telling stories, talking about his dad and talking about the radio station he listened to as a kid, and Wendy and Lisa and what they meant, to certain songs. And he was just in this very open, reflective place. And it's so tragic that he wasn't able to complete those stories and to get that part down, for the record, because that would have been incredible, for all of us to help understand him and understand, all these beautiful songs that he made.
Total shock. 57, right? 57 years old. And then he
Yeah.
came off that Super Bowl performance where, like, all of a sudden he it was like he was poised for this next phase. And
Yeah,
it blew people away with that performance. Yeah.
absolutely.
So getting back to the record, The Beautiful Ones, track 3, recorded at the legendary Sunset Sound Studios, which I'm wearing my Van Halen shirt, which is where many of the Van Halen albums were recorded, on Hollywood Boulevard. And it was all during one marathon session. A lot of speculation over the years as to who this is about. What did Prince have to say about it?
Well, yeah, the quotes from him about this song are really fascinating because, of course, there's all this speculation over the years of different women that thought it might be about them, and he said, "Look, it was written for a movie. It's written for these characters in this movie." And like all good art, I'm sure it was inspired by experiences that he had in his real life, but he was so talented at creating these characters and to put himself into the position that his character in the film was in at that point, which was in absolute agony over Apollonia and writhing around on the floor on stage. And he delivered a torch ballad for the ages alone in a studio, which is so incredible. I had just the delight of interviewing a few of his engineers from this era. Both of them are women, and I love speaking to both of them. Peggy McCreary is the one, that spent a lot of time alone at Sunset Sound with Prince. She was a staff engineer there. And then Susan Rogers became his basically in-house engineer and came to his warehouses in Minnesota and set up all these kind of roughshod, recording situations so she could capture it as it's pouring out of him. But yeah, they both said that there were definitely sessions that lasted longer than 24 hours. And I think Peggy's longest session was 36 or 40 hours, where they're just trying to stay awake and trying to keep up with this man as he's laying down track after track after track. And, the really cool thing to me to think about is that he would lay down each instrument and know exactly where to speed up or slow down or where the breaks in the songs were going to be. It was all in his head. So he could lay down the drums and then he would put the bass part over it and then the guitar or the piano over that and then his vocals at the end. And it would become a perfectly composed piece with all of these different elements. And I just can't fathom, another artist on that level that was able to do that all alone.
Yeah, that might be my favorite of the non-hits from the album.
Mm,
I think Susan Rogers was. Maybe you saw these interviews. Sunset Sound has their own YouTube channel. Did you see when she
yeah.
was? Yeah, and then I believe Apollonia too, and she was telling a story about she was dating David Lee Roth, and Prince said, "No, I don't want you to be like they couldn't be seen together in public or something." There was something that Prince he was very specific about. I remember that. I can't remember the specifics, but yeah.
He had a lot of specific guidance for anyone that was going to be working with him on how they should be acting out in public.
Yeah. Love those stories. Yeah. Wendy Melvoin shared with you just how challenging her dual guitar solo with Prince was for her. Her hands, or his hands, she said, were shaped to do that lick. Hers weren't. So she said it was hard to master. But I think this is on the Beautiful Ones, right? Isn't that on the?
That's in Computer Blue
Oh,
that
I'm
she's
sorry,
talking
Computer
about.
Blue.
Yeah.
Yes, let's talk about Computer Blue. Okay, Computer Blue is the
Wendy.
one. Yeah, Wendy Melvoin. She talked about that one, and that was the challenge. Her guitar solo with Prince, and the hands and all that stuff. So talk about that,
Yeah.
and I think Prince gave his father songwriting credit on this one too, right?
Yes. Yeah. Computer Blue is Wendy and Lisa and his father, all co-credited as songwriters of different elements of the song. Um, I had a really fun experience watching a live performance from the Purple Rain tour with Wendy and Lisa. They wanted to watch it again because they hadn't watched it in so many years. It's live in Syracuse, New York. It was released as Prince and the Revolution live, and it's been remastered a few times in recent years. So we all watched it together. And that was where she was commenting about, when you're working with Prince, and Dr. Fink had commented this too, he's got all these ideas of what you can do in a song and it works because he's in the studio and you're able to isolate a track and or punch it in or fix it if you don't like it. But then all of a sudden they have to roll out this huge Purple Rain tour and play all of these things live. And Wendy was saying that that really angular riff in Computer Blue was so easy for Prince, but for her, she had slightly smaller hands, and suddenly she had to just jump in and learn all of these things and be able to replicate it night after night after night on tour. And it was very challenging. But she did it. You can hear it in the live recording. She did it.
And why did he give his father songwriting credit on this
Oh,
song?
yes.
There was a story behind that, wasn't there?
Yes, yeah, there is. So there's kind of a bridge in the song where it becomes more spacey sounding, and there's this riff that ended up also appearing in the song Father's Song, which is not on the album, but in the soundtrack to the film. There's a scene where it's played on the piano, and it's really beautiful. And that all came from Prince's father. He was a jazz piano player who played for many, many years here in Minneapolis. He performed under the name Prince Rogers. So he had a Prince Rogers combo, Prince Rogers trio. Sometimes he was just alone. And he was really an entertainer and someone that was gigging a lot around town and a huge influence on Prince. At some point, they became somewhat estranged, but then around the time that Prince was working on Purple Rain, they patched up their relationship and he began appearing in Prince's life again. So I think giving him that co-credit, it was not only a nod to what he had given Prince musically and that idea that really inspired Prince in the writing of Computer Blue, but also as just a way to say, like, look, I want you to be part of my success, and I want this token of appreciation to, lead to some dividends for you as a way to say, thank you and I forgive you. And that, you're in my life again.
I think he said too that he shared both characteristics of his mom and dad.
Yes,
And that came out in the music too. Did he have a good
absolutely.
relationship with his mom?
I would say they were both challenged relationships. He ran away from home at a pretty young age. He was 12, if all the lore is to be believed in the interviews that I've done and research I've done. It seems like it was around the time he was 12 years old that he ran away. His parents had divorced a couple years prior, and his mom remarried a man that became Prince's stepfather, and they did not get along. And there's certainly insinuation in things that Prince said and wrote that that was an abusive relationship for him, his stepfather. So that was really complicated, not being able to be with his mother because of this volatile situation. And then he went to live with his father, and his father was a very conservative religious person and didn't like Prince running around with girls. So they started butting heads when Prince moved in with his dad. So then he ended up moving out again. He spent some time living with an aunt and then eventually finished out his high school career living with his best friend at the time, Andre Anderson, who we know as Andre Simone, who was in Prince's early band and became his own solo recording artist and everything. So it was a rocky start to life, and a really challenging time for Prince. And I think that led to periods of estrangement and then periods of closeness. And that continued on and off again throughout the rest of his parents' lives.
And they influenced When Doves Cry.
Yes, yes, and he wrote that explicitly in the pages that he was able to get down for his memoir, that is based on true events, and the dynamic of his parents, that they had a sometimes explosive relationship, and that was something that he witnessed as a very young kid.
Yeah, his first number one single too.
Yeah.
Just that kicks off side two. Going back just to finish up side one was Darling Nikki, which got Tipper Gore's attention. Not in a good way. Yeah,
Yes.
he had a good laugh talking about it years later. What was her issue with the song? And
Well, so she had her daughter brought home Purple Rain and played at some point. She heard Darling Nikki. And at this point, the record had been out for like a year or something. So it wasn't breaking news, but I guess it was in her household, that there was this very explicit song on the record. And it led her to kick off this whole campaign against explicit music. We can thank Prince for the explicit
yeah.
warning sticker that used to appear on, CDs, and now we see it as the E on streaming services. And she made a list of the filthy 15, the most offensive songs from the mid 80s as she was campaigning with all of these other mostly right-wing women at the time. They formed this parental resource group. I forget the full acronym, but basically a advocacy group to try to warn parents about the scandalous music that was being released, and and Prince was at the very top of that list.
Little did they know that just boosted sales even more.
Yes.
You don't tell a kid you can't get that. It's like, and the best was Dee Snider when it goes to Washington and there's Al Gore and Dee Snider, who's an intelligent guy, and he had this whole speech written up, and it's on YouTube. People can see. I mean, he's so great. He just flips his hair back like, take that. It was so great. Yeah, that's amazing. Oh boy, Andrea Swensson is the author of Prince and Purple Rain, 40 years, due out. Let's see, May 21st. So very soon, very soon.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
yeah. Well, this episode will go up just before the release date, so people can go on to Amazon and either pre-order it or order it, depending on when you listen to this interview. Let's get into. We talked about When Doves Cry. Actually, one more thing on that one. No bass on this track, right? He fought.
Yes.
This is fascinating. He fought in his mind over this one. So I guess there are two different versions.
Yes.
Do we hear the
Yep.
one with bass, and is that somewhere like on a deluxe edition?
I don't know if it's ever been released.
Okay.
Maybe I want to say bootleggers have probably
Yeah.
circulated it, as they say, but yeah, I don't think it was included on the Purple Rain Deluxe that was put out a few years back.
His
Um,
reasoning is interesting. Why did he leave the bass out?
well, so he yeah, there's these stories about him being in the studio and calling in various members of his orbit and saying, "What do you think about this?" and kind of toggling it off and on the board and saying, I kind of think I'm leaning towards having it out. And it was Jill Jones who sang a lot of backing vocals for Prince in this period and was in the studio with him a lot. She said, "Well, he said, if I could have it my way, I would just put it out without the bass on it." And she said, "Well, why don't you have it your way then?" And, kind of gave him that, external validation of like, if you think that's what it needs to be, then you should do it. And it was Dr. Fink, actually, when I was interviewing him about it, said, the interesting thing about this is that the way that he tuned the Lindrum, the electronic drums in that song, it was tuned down so low that the rhythm of the drums is almost filling in your mind where the bass would be anyways. So it's not immediately obvious that it's missing. And it creates this kind of unsettling feeling when you're listening to the song because something is just a little bit off, but it's kind of hard to tell what it is.
Yeah.
And yeah, what a brilliant move. And then, of course, it goes to the top of the charts.
Yeah. I would put the next track behind the title track as my second favorite from Purple Rain. Again, we're talking about the singles. I Would Die for You. I mean,
Mm.
amazing. And it was written before the film script, yet it mirrors a line in the film. Can you talk about that? And an interesting observation that you give in the book regarding the film's director, Albert Magnoli, and his ability to listen closely to Prince's music and lyrics and bring them to life on screen. You talk about that in the book.
Yeah, there's been so much, speculation over the years of what is autobiographical in the film Purple Rain, and I really do think it speaks to Albert Magnoli's ear that he was able to pick up on these themes that Prince was stating lyrically and put them into a story where it feels so true that you don't know kind of where the line is between fact and fiction. And Prince was so compelling as a songwriter in building these worlds and these arcs and these characters. And I think that's just such a great example of, he wrote this song, he had these really striking lyrics, and, to have it appear as something that his movie dad is then, saying to his family in the film as this kind of abusive, terrorizing character who's, really struggling, obviously, emotionally with how to relate to his family. It's such a compelling use of the lyrics and creating this like really cohesive story. Yeah, I just love that. And I also love the story about how when Albert Magnolia came to Minneapolis and started working on the script, there was already a script written, but Prince didn't like it, so he was hired to kind of come in and basically reimagine it to be more authentic. Prince handed him cassettes full of dozens and dozens of songs and said, "Well, here's some. Do you think we could use these?" It's just wild how prolific he was. That he's just had these volumes of unreleased material at the ready. And Albert Magnolia was really key in helping him to kind of refine some of those, lists of songs down into things like "I Would Die for You" that could be really evocative in a film. He also helped Prince to select Purple Rain as the title of the movie, which is also just such a great story. He was at the First Avenue show, August '83, when Prince debuted that song, and Albert Magnoli told the story about coming up to Prince afterwards and saying, "What was that one? That was a really incredible song." And he said, I think it's Purple Rain, and I'm thinking of calling maybe the album this, or maybe it could even be the film." And Albert Magnoli's like, "Yeah, yeah, we're gonna do that."
Yeah.
That is it. So I think, yeah, he needs to get some credit there for coming in, basically not even knowing Prince at all and being able to, mostly through his music, pick up on so much of who he was and what he wanted to say.
You talk about all the music that he wrote, and in the book, there's the chapter on Paisley Park and how was it when they went to get in there they had a guy he had to break the lock or whatever it was.
Yes.
Like it was like tapes and cassettes just like almost falling off. Like as soon as you open the door, it's like it's all falling out. It was like packed with music, right? It's like hundreds and hundreds of hours of videos and music in there.
Yes. Yeah. Real, huge reels, analog tapes, and then
Crazy, man.
video footage and hard drives and photos and documents, lots of documents. Yeah, they had a vault in the basement of Paisley Park that had a huge, kind of classic bank vault door. And then the room leading up to that door also over the years became completely jam packed with stuff because at one point, I guess, Prince he was kind of known for firing people that worked for him. And he would go through these periods where there were not that many people even working at Paisley Park. And it would kind of be this little skeleton crew. And at one point, all the people that knew the code for the vault had been fired. So no one even knew how to get in there. So they just started leaving the tapes at the door to the vault and it just kept amassing more and more and more and more. And it's really wild to think about, just the volume of material that existed.
Yeah, he opened it, or he had it built in 89.
87 is
Oh,
when
it
it
was
opened.
87.
Yep. Hmm.
It's just the amount of I mean, since he passed away, there's been so much music that's come out, and
Yes.
that just
Yeah.
tells
And
you.
now, thankfully, the archival teams that went into Paisley Park after he passed, they realized pretty quickly that the conditions of that basement were not ideal, especially the pre-vault room that was just overflowing with stuff.
Right, like no
Um,
temperature control or anything like that.
yeah. Yeah, and they said they even smelled like a kind of acidic smell in the air, which could indicate that some things were starting to deteriorate and that there had been leaking at one point, and just kind of a nightmare scenario for any librarian or archivist to uncover. And so they moved all of that to an Iron Mountain facility where it's been properly stored and is in the process of being cataloged and digitized. And just thankfully that was able to happen in time to rescue all of this material and properly preserve it. Because, gosh, I hope eventually someday that all ends up in like the Smithsonian or somewhere
Oh, I'm sure.
where it can be
Yeah,
really studied and appreciated on the level that it needs to be.
yeah, I'm sure. There are a lot of biopics out there now. Do you know of anything in the works? Has there been talk about that?
So there's been a couple things announced recently. There's a Broadway musical in production that is going to open in Minneapolis in 2025, and then go travel probably to Broadway next, I would think. I think they're staging it in Minneapolis at one of the theaters here. And then they did announce that there is going to be a biopic. I don't know a lot of details about it. I think it was basically just a report that it was in the works.
Okay.
I don't know when that would come out, or, obviously the big question in both of those is who's going to play Prince, because what a daunting role to have to assume. So I haven't heard any
Mm,
details beyond that, but there has been a lot of movement on these kind of bigger projects that people have been wondering about for many years.
Sometimes those can come to fruition quickly, but sometimes, like the Elton John movie, that went on for years and years and years. There were several actors that were rumored to play him, and then finally they had the actor that they eventually picked. But so you just don't know. But boy, that would be quite a story. I mean, it's his
Mm,
his life story. It would be great. And with the Bob Marley film, which was amazing, they got an unknown actor, so you could go one way or the other on that. But you're right. Yeah,
right.
daunting to play Prince. Yeah, Baby, I'm a Star. The backward loop vocals at the start is the Revolution's Lisa Coleman saying, "So like, fuck them, man. What do they know? Come on, baby, let's go crazy." This is interesting as far as how that song develops over time live. So this would be extended
Yes.
as long as 20 minutes in concert. That's wild.
Yeah, that became kind of the showpiece of the Purple Rain tour, that they would stretch it further and further and further. And, Prince was such a restless musician and creative person that, by the time the Purple Rain tour rolled out, he was over this material. He had moved on. He had Around the World in a Day, the next album fully recorded and in the can. And he was already starting to think about his next movie and the soundtrack to that movie. And he was working on more side projects, like with the band The Family. So the idea of having to play these songs over and over again was like a nightmare for him. And you can see in the live performances of Baby I'm a Star, that's him stretching that band as far as they can go and saying, all right, we're going to jam on this one chord for 10 minutes. Let's see what happens. Let's build up a groove that is so funky that we're just going to put everyone in a trance. And he would be directing them like James Brown, on the one, and give me 4 and give me 24 and all these crazy things to keep them nimble and to keep them, on their toes. It's just such a great example of, how restless and just forward thinking he always was at any time. But it also became kind of famous for, that's when the cameos would happen. So when he played his run of shows in LA during Baby I'm a Star one night, that was when both Bruce Springsteen and Madonna joined Prince on stage. And there's some really good stories about that, as he's basically trying to make Bruce Springsteen look dumb by miscuing him and cueing the band to do all these crazy counting things behind him as he's trying to play
Oh.
his guitar, and and the band's going, "Come on, man, it's the boss. Like, are we going to humiliate him?"
Bruce's version of Purple Rain after Prince passed is great. And then he made a joke about how, wasn't it? It was a Dancing in the Dark that was number 2, and it never made it to number 1 because of I think maybe When Doves Cry was number 1. I can't remember, but it was some funny
That
joke he
sounds
made.
right.
Now, so this is interesting. Speaking of live and how obviously Prince was just such a creative person, I can't imagine him. I could just see him just going nuts playing the same songs every night. Did he mix up the set list a lot? Like, was he the type of person? I can't imagine that he would be like, okay, you got to finish with this song every night. You got to play the hits. Did he just play whatever he wanted to play? Kind of like what's an example? I mean, I think of Grateful Dead or like a Van Morrison. Like, you don't know what to expect.
I mean, later for sure.
Yeah,
The
okay.
Purple Rain tour, though, unfortunately, it was for him. Fortunately for everyone else, because it was a great show, but it was so scripted because there was so many elaborate stage elements, and this was at a time when, something as simple to us now is changing out, a color scheme for lights actually required like a lot of planning and and technical supplies. So I had talked to his who ended up being a creative director for many years alongside him, Roy Bennett. And he said, there was just so many moving parts and little sets that he had built and different parts of the stage that would move around and accommodate these different little scenes, that it had to be the same every night because there was just too much going on. But then, you can kind of see him rebelling against that. By the late 80s, he went on what he called the nude tour, where it was all just stripped down, no huge crazy stages, no crazy, multi-moving thing, parts. At one point, like in the Love Sexy tour, he literally had a little car he would drive out on stage. Like, it got so crazy.
Well, he's very Bruce Springsteen-like, actually. Now, what am I
Yes.
saying? I'm a huge Bruce fan. That's what Bruce would do. All of a sudden, he come out of
Yeah.
nowhere with a solo acoustic album, and then a tour where it's just him. It's like, oh, where's the E Street Band?
Right. Yeah.
That is the artist's mind. They can't do the same thing over and over and over again. Yeah, that's that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we finish with the title track. It's Purple Rain. I mean, it's just a brilliant piece of work. The Joni Mitchell thing is fascinating. You mentioned it early. Tell me about this. I never knew this. There's a connection with Joni Mitchell on this song.
Yeah. And, part of this is like my theory about it. And just speaking at length with Wendy and Lisa about their shared admiration of Joni with Prince, that was something that really bonded the three of them together musically. But what really resonated with me as I was going through this whole period of his career and really thinking deeply about it was, at that show at First Avenue in August '83, the only other song on the set list that sounds anything like Purple Rain is his Joni cover, A Case of You. And it's really spare and beautiful and kind of atmospheric and slow, and it just it kind of puts this little breathing space in the set, and it's just like a really tender moment. And when you get to the end and you start, those iconic opening chords of Purple Rain, those are all Joni chords to me. I mean, and Wendy has talked extensively about this. It's, all these 11 and 13 chords that create all these beautiful, sometimes kind of odd and disorienting harmonies within themselves. And it's these voicings that paint this beautiful tapestry of colors. And I think you're hearing that in the way that she performed those chords and the arrangement of the chords that, she and Prince came up with together at the rehearsals. And then just the way that song unfolds and tells all of these stories in such a mesmerizing way. I think it's just such a great encapsulation of his appreciation for Joni and for the way that he could take an inspiration like that and channel it into something so unique and beautiful and so him. But it doesn't sound like anything else he'd released up to that point.
No,
So it's
not
just
at all.
such an interesting part of his career and his story. And it, of course, lived, on and on and on. That was the song that people wanted to hear when he was playing concerts throughout the rest of his life.
The Minnesota Vikings thing. Now, tell me about this and why they did this.
I love
Love it.
this story
I
too.
love this.
So much of the music that was performed at that First Avenue show, it was all being recorded, for the film, for the album. And it was full of all these local people that loved Prince and came out to all the things that he did. But most of that song or most of that set list was brand new. So they weren't familiar with it yet. So they were silent. They,
Right.
there was no clap of recognition as these now iconic songs are
They weren't
starting.
familiar with it.
They're just
Brand
like,
new.
huh,
Yeah.
like cool. So it was, they were kind of stunned into silence. And David Z, Bobby Z's brother, who was a producer, is a producer and, was really close with Prince and helped him a lot. He actually helped Prince record his demos, like as he was starting to shop around to labels. He was outside of First Avenue in this recording truck and he was capturing, the not just the band, but also the room and the reactions and everything. And when it came time to put the soundtrack together, he's like, well, we have to add something to capture, excitement around around this material. So he took a recording of a Minnesota Vikings game and took the applause and the cheering out of that and put it into Purple Rain.
I love that. I absolutely love that. One other really cool piece of trivia, and I apologize, I don't know if it's in your book or not, but the Stevie Nicks comments about she could have been on this song, according to her.
Right. Right.
What?
Yeah, 'cause they had come so close to working well, they did work together, but they
Right.
wanted to actually write together. She had her song Stand Back released the year Purple Rain was being made. I think it came out in 83. And that was really closely inspired by Little Red Corvette.
Yeah.
And she actually, it was so close that she had to call Prince and ask him permission to rip rip him off, basically.
Yeah. And then he
And
plays on it, right? Didn't
yeah,
he like went right from he gets off the phone and he's like there in like an hour or
yes,
whatever it was. And
yeah, yeah.
he's playing the synths on that, I believe.
Yep. Showed up
That's
at the studio, laid down the synths. I think they were maybe in the studio together for 20 minutes and then
yeah,
he's off
yeah.
into the night again. But so they had wanted to, from that experience, actually collaborate more closely together on like co-arranging or co-writing a song. And she had the opportunity. She was presented with that early demo recording of Purple Rain and she turned it down. And
She
who
said
knows
she was
why?
just intimidated. She said it was like she felt like I wasn't gonna be able to live up to the expectations. I think is what she said. That's wild. That is
Yeah.
wild. Yeah. So calling this his greatest is debatable, among fans because it just speaks to how amazing his catalog of work is. But where do you put it? Like personally for you, where do you place this album?
Oof. Yeah, there's a lot of debate in the Prince fan community about what we consider quote unquote to be his best versus his most commercially successful. And it's kind of considered lame to be a fan of Purple Rain because he had so many other compelling periods of his career. But for me, just speaking as, someone that studied his career so closely and thinking critically about this album, it is such a cohesive artistic statement. And I think Prince really responded well to constraints as much as he fought against having any constraints and any boundaries in anything that he ever made. When he was focused on a specific project and it was for a purpose and that purpose was defined, and he knew what he was on a mission to do, I think that's when you see some of his most just amazing work because he had this idea for the film. He knew what it was going to be about. He knew generally what the characters were going to be, what he wanted to say in these songs, and it allowed him to go into these worlds and really open up and explore, what he could deliver emotionally in that story, what he could introduce musically. And I think just as an album, this collection of songs is just it's such a definitive work of art. It really stands as a set in a way that is so rare, especially now, that everything is so fractured into singles and drips and drabs of releases. And to have that, really old school classic album. I know that was something that he really valued and he spoke about throughout his career, that he considered himself to be of that, generation of artists that was really making a set of music for people. And Purple Rain is just one of the ultimate albums in that it, really delivers on what it promises from the beginning.
Yeah, there was one song that he performed at that concert that was intended for the album he left off. Wasn't there one?
Oh, yeah, Electric Intercourse.
Yeah, that was one. That was one. So what are 9 tracks in all, I think, on this album. So yeah, I mean, it's there's no fillers in this. I mean, it's a work of art. But I tell you, that follow-up album, I love Around the World in a Day, man. But that just shows you how there's no way he was going to make a Purple Rain Part 2. So it's like, this is totally Raspberry Beret and Pop Life. I mean, those are just, there's just the sound. He changed constantly and just prolific. I mean, through the 90s into the 2000s, I mean, it's amazing to think what he would still be doing now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Prince and Purple Rain, 40 years. So it's due out May 21st through Motorbooks, and you can find it wherever books are sold. So tell us where people can find you online. Tell us about the podcast, what else you got going on? Where can people find you?
Yeah. So I have a website that's just my name, AndreaSwensson.com, SSON. And then I'm online all over the place at Slingshot Annie. The podcast has been so fun to work on. We do basically seasons that are around releases that are coming out. So we've done episodes about 1999, Sign of the Times. There was a full vault album that got released called Welcome to America that Prince recorded in 2010. So we did a season around that. And then our most recent season was about Diamonds and Pearls. That box set came out last year. And it's so fun to me to get to talk to a lot of people that were really active in like 1 year of Prince's life and just nerd out about how much he was doing in these like really finite periods of time and how many different, side projects and vault tracks and things he just had pouring out of him all the time. So that's what the podcast is. No additional seasons yet announced, but it's been an ongoing project and just a really, really fun thing to work on. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts, as they say.
That's it. Yeah.
Just the official Prince podcast, it's called.
Yep. I'll put a link to the podcast, the website in the show notes so people can go there. Andrea, thank you. This was a great discussion about an amazing album and film.
Aww. Thank you. Thank you, Eric, for inviting me. I could obviously talk about this endlessly, but I really appreciate your questions and your comments about the book. This has just been such a really fun thing to work on.